Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Week 6, Stardom Situm. We've got every game, every matchup, starts and sits. Let's get right into it. Alright, so first up we have our Thursday night football game. We've got the Chiefs versus the Broncos. First off, we're going to start Patrick Mahomes. It's pretty obvious. The Broncos give up the second most points per game to quarterbacks with 21.5. They've allowed the most passing touchdowns in the NFL, and Mahomes is still putting up pretty impressive fantasy numbers in a questionable offense. You know, all of the receivers other than Kelsey are just pretty awful, so it's kind of crazy that he's still able to put up 20 points a game. But you're going to want to start him, of course. Wilson, the Chiefs allowed the 10th least points per game to quarterbacks, but they've only gotten one interception this season. Wilson is currently the number 10 fantasy quarterback, and a lot of that has to do with the Broncos tailing games. So it's going to have to force him to throw the ball a lot more. He scored 23 in both games versus Kansas City last year, and I think that because of how bad the Broncos defense is, Russell Wilson's going to have to do a lot more, and he's going to have to score a lot more. Up next, we have the Titans versus the Ravens. You're going to want to start Lamar. The Titans allow the 11th least points per game to quarterbacks with 14.7. And they've only allowed 5 passing touchdowns, which is tied for the 8th least. But they've only forced 1 interception, and they allow the 9th most passing yards. Lamar is currently the number 12 fantasy quarterback, and he has the most rushing yards and most rushing touchdowns by QB this season. If it wasn't for that stat, you would of course want to sit Lamar, but because he has the rushing ability, you're going to want to start him each and every week because he's going to be able to produce those points. As for Ryan Tannehill, you're going to want to sit him. The Ravens allowed the second least points per game to quarterbacks, and Tannehill is the 28th ranked fantasy quarterback with 11.22 points per game. He's also only thrown 2 touchdowns to 5 interceptions. He has no upside here into starting against a tough Ravens defense, to say the least. So you're going to want to sit him. Falcons versus Commanders is up next, and this one might be a little controversial. I'm going to start both Sam Howell and Desmond Ridder. Sam Howell, Atlanta allows 15.31 points per game to the quarterback, which is about the league average. He's currently the number 14 fantasy quarterback with 17.61 points per game. But Atlanta allows the 7th least passing yards. This one is about a lean start for me. I think he's proven himself. He has thrown quite a number of interceptions, but 4 of those, I believe, came again in one game. So I'm not going to hold that against him. He's playing decently good football, and he's playing pretty good fantasy football. So he's going to lean start for me against the Falcons. Desmond Ridder, I'm going to start, and I know this is controversial because I completely trash-talked him last week, but Washington does allow the 3rd most points per game to quarterbacks with just over 21, and they have the 4th most passing touchdowns allowed to quarterbacks. He's the 19 fantasy quarterback coming off of his best game. I think that Ridder could capitalize on this success, and I think he could find himself scoring another 20 points again. I would definitely lean towards starting him. Up next, we have the divisional matchup in the NFC North between the Bears and the Vikings. We're going to go ahead and we're going to start Justin Fields. The Vikings have allowed the 9th most points per game to quarterbacks with 19.31, and they've allowed the 5th most passing touchdowns in the game, or tied for it with 8. Fields is currently the number 3 fantasy quarterback, and he is just kind of killing it over the last couple of weeks, and especially against really bad defenses, which the Vikings have an atrocious defense. So Fields, for now, you're just going to want to start him. He's picking up the pace, and he's scoring points, winning leagues. Kirk Cousins is going to be my start of the week. Now, for this reason, it's because the Bears have allowed the most points per game to quarterbacks with 22.37 per game. They've also allowed the 2nd most pass touchdowns in the NFL, and the Vikings are a heavy pass offense. They don't run the ball efficiently, and therefore they don't run the ball. Along with that, Kirk Cousins is the number 4 fantasy quarterback. He has a good matchup. It's a good time to start him against the Bears. He's my start of the week. Bears versus Seahawks. This one was really rough for me. I, for the life of me, really wanted to sit Joe Burrow, and I actually almost put him in the sit column. But I'm still going to end up starting him. He's coming off his best performance of the season with 24 points. He's the 26th ranked fantasy quarterback. You shouldn't sleep on the Seahawks defense. Their secondary is starting to pick up, and I think that they could limit Burrow really, really hard. But the Bengals' offense is too explosive and too talented for me to sit Joe Burrow. But I really, really was tempted to. Geno Smith, the Bengals are tied for the 5th most interceptions in the NFL. He's not performing fantasy-wise. He's the number 24 fantasy quarterback with 14.46 points per game, and that's just not going to do it in these fantasy leagues. He's ranked bottom half of starting quarterbacks in 3 of the 4 weeks that he's played, and even though it's amounted to Seahawk wins, it's just not viable for fantasy wins, and that's why we're going to sit him. Up next, we have the 49ers versus the Browns. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start Brock Purdy. I put him on my sit list last week, and he proved me wrong. I, as a 49ers fan, I did not expect him to go out and just do that. The Browns do allow the 4th least points per game to quarterbacks with 11.6, but they've only forced 1 interception. Purdy's currently the 11th fantasy quarterback, and he's consistent with good ball placement. He's playing really well, and he has thrown no interceptions so far. There's no reason for me to sit him until he gives me a reason to. As for Deshaun Watson, or if he doesn't play, the rookie from UCLA, I can't think of, Dorian Thompson, they're both going to be sad. The 49ers allow the 3rd least points per game to quarterbacks with 11.4. They forced 8 interceptions, tied for the most in the NFL, and Watson's dealing with an injury, so he's not going to fare pretty well. And when the backup comes in, if the backup plays, I see the 49ers defense kind of just mowing through the Browns, so I would not start a Browns quarterback this week. Texans versus Saints are up next, and I'm going to go ahead and sit both of these guys. As for CJ Stroud, the Saints allow the 6th least points per game to quarterbacks with just about 12.5, but the Saints have 7 interceptions to go along with that. That's tied for the 3rd most, and they allow the 4th least passing yards total, which is just under 200 per game. He is the number 14 quarterback with 0 interceptions though so far, but it's not a good matchup for him. As for Derek Carr, he's the number 31st ranked fantasy quarterback. He's averaging just over 10 points per game. The Saints are winning some of their games, like a lot of their games actually, but it's not translating well into fantasy points for players, apart from, say, Chris Olave, Michael Thomas, and Kamara. It specifically is not translating well for Derek Carr, so you're going to sit him until he proves to be fantasy viable again. Next up, we have the Jaguars versus the Colts. You're going to want to start Trevor Lawrence. He hasn't fared very well this year so far, fantasy-wise. He's the number 17 fantasy quarterback. But the Colts do allow the 11th most points per game to quarterbacks with 18.66. His only top 15 finish this season was against the Colts in Week 1. So that gives him just a lot more to go starting him versus the Colts. But he does have a fumbling problem right now. He fumbled 3 times versus the Bills and lost 2 of them. So he is struggling a little bit right now, but I would still start him. As for Gardner Minshew, you're going to want to sit him. The Jaguars are allowing the 10th most points per game to quarterbacks with 19.34. He's efficient when he plays, but he doesn't break fantasy banks, so he doesn't produce a lot of fantasy points. He has a good matchup, but I'd like to see how he clicks with the offense first, especially after watching his play against the Ravens and seeing if he can be fantasy viable to us in the future. The Dolphins versus the Panthers are up next, and you're going to want to start Tua. He's the number 5 fantasy quarterback. He was the MVP favorite before last week when he threw 2 interceptions versus the Giants, and he is tied for the 2nd most passing touchdowns in the NFL. But Carolina does allow the 9th least points per game to quarterbacks, so it's a little iffy. Carolina's defense is playing really well, but I see Tua being able to at least be a top half quarterback in fantasy this week. As for Bryce Young, you're going to want to sit him. Miami does allow the 8th most points per game to quarterbacks with 19.41. He is coming off the best game of his career, which is the only game he's had above QB 23. But I want to see some consistency before I start him. I don't want to just throw him in there after having one good game and expect him to reproduce. I want to see it multiple times. Raiders versus Patriots are another one of those two quarterback both sit-em games. Mac Jones has had 4 straight finishes of QB 23 or worse. He's currently the 26th quarterback in fantasy. The Raiders do allow the 6th most points per game to quarterback, but Jones is coming off of a negative fantasy game. Just sit him. He's doing way too much. He's struggling way too much to even be considered a start anymore. So sit him. As for Jimmy G, the Patriots allow the 6th least points per game to quarterbacks with 12.28. And Jimmy G has thrown the most interceptions in the NFL with 7. He's QB 19 or worse against teams who rank in the top half against quarterbacks in fantasy, and the Patriots fall under that line, so you're going to want to sit him and just avoid this game altogether. We've got the Jets versus the Eagles up next, and you're going to want to start Jalen Hurts. He's the number 2 quarterback in fantasy. He averages 40 rushing yards and just about a touchdown per game. He has 4 top 10 finishes this season in 5 weeks. He's a definite start. As for Zach Wilson, the Eagles do allow the 7th points per game to quarterbacks with 19.84, but the Eagles have an overwhelming defensive line, and it's going to cause Zach to make mistakes. It's not going to be a game where he's going to go in and he's going to build his confidence like he did against the Chiefs. I think that the Eagles are a better team than the Chiefs. I think that everything is telling me that the stats should say Zach Wilson should start, but I'm going to sit him, and I think you should too. Up next, we have another divisional matchup between the Rams and the Cardinals. First off, for Matt Stafford, you're going to want to start him. The Cardinals allow the 4th most points per game to quarterbacks with just under 21, and they've allowed 8 passing touchdowns, tied for the 5th most in the NFL. He's currently the QB 15 in fantasy, and he just got Cooper Kupp back, which means he's going to pad those stats, and he's going to get into his favorite receiver, and that should lead to a lot more points. As for Josh Dobbs, I almost put him in the sit column, but I lean towards starting him because the Rams do allow the 12th most points per game to quarterbacks with just under 17.8. They have only allowed 4 passing touchdowns, tied for the 3rd least, but Josh Dobbs is the QB 16 in fantasy. I'm going to lean to start him, but you should sit him if you have better options. I do, however, think that there are a lot of tough matchups this week for quarterbacks. So I think Josh Dobbs is going to be one of those guys that you might want to start versus, say, if you have Mac Jones or somebody else where the matchup is just so horrid that you don't even want to touch them. The Buccaneers versus the Lions was another tough matchup for me to decide. I decided to start both of them. Jared Goff, for the reason that he's the number 10 quarterback in fantasy. However, the Buccaneers do allow the 8th least points per game to quarterbacks. That is, however, facing against Bryce Young and Derek Carr, who pretty much just put up goose eggs, might as well have. But the Lions are the 4th most scoring team in the NFL, averaging 29.6 points per game, and they average the 6th most total yards per game, 9th in passing. I think Jared Goff has the weapons, and I think he could be really successful this week versus the Buccaneers. As for Baker, he's looking good this year. He's the number 20 fantasy quarterback with a bye. The Lions allow the 3rd least rushing yards per game in the NFL, and the Buccaneers have the 8th worst rushing offense in the NFL, which means that Baker's going to have to throw the ball a lot more. He has the protection. He's been sacked, almost the least in the NFL, if not the least. He should have plenty of time in the pocket to make good decisions. I think that despite everything, he does pretty well this week against the Lions. Up next, we've got the Bills versus the Giants, and Josh Allen, you're going to want to start him. Do I need to even say any more? He's the number 1 fantasy quarterback. He has the 2nd most passing touchdowns and the 5th most passing yards. You're going to want to start him. As for Daniel Jones, the Giants need to figure it out before you ever touch this guy again, before he ever goes onto any rosters. He has 4 quarterback finishes of 24 or worse. He has 6 interceptions, tied for the 2nd most, and the Bills allow the least points per game to quarterbacks with 9.2. Just sit Daniel Jones and call it a day. And last but not least, we have Monday Night Football, the Chargers versus the Cowboys. For Dak Prescott, you're going to want to start him. Chargers allowing the 5th most points per game to quarterbacks at just under 21. Every quarterback apart from the rookie who faced them last week, as in week 4, has scored over 20 points against the Chargers. He did throw 3 interceptions versus the 49ers, so he's going to need this bounce-back game, and I don't see any opponent better than the Chargers to do that against. For Justin Herbert, he's the number 11 fantasy quarterback, and that's with a bye. The Cowboys do allow the 5th least points per game to quarterbacks with 11.83, and the Cowboys are reeling off of 26 points from Brock Purdy last week. But Herbert is Herbert. He's throwing the ball 36 times a game. He has 7 touchdowns and 1 interception this season. He's a quarterback 1 option regardless of who he plays and what defense he plays, so I wouldn't overthink it. Justin Herbert should be started. And that's going to do it for me, guys. I've gotten so much support over the last week for these fantasy videos. If you guys love these videos and you guys want to see more content like this, make sure you guys subscribe and comment if you're new here. Smash that like button. Ask me questions. I love hearing fantasy football questions. Ask me who I should recommend to start or sit. And I'll catch you guys in the next episode. Peace.